Autumn 1937. Berlin. The sprawling offices of the Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment pulsed with a relentless, controlled energy. Below Joseph Goebbels's infamous gilded halls, nestled amongst endless rows of filing cabinets and clattering typewriters, sat an individual whose role, outwardly unremarkable, quietly underpinned much of the ruling party's pervasive influence over the public imagination. Walter Brandt, a seemingly unassuming junior officer, was officially tasked with cultural oversight and media narrative cohesion. His days were spent poring over newspaper clippings, vetting film scripts, scrutinizing radio programs, and ensuring every cultural output, no matter how trivial, echoed the regime's powerful messaging. His office was a testament to meticulous order, yet often a repository for cultural contradictions. Among the somber posters of muscular farm workers and triumphant soldiers, an unexpected flicker of color once caught the eye of an inquisitive intern, a pristine large-format cinematic storyboard, carefully laid out, depicting quaint cartoon animals and a princess with lips as red as freshly spilled blood. This was no ordinary propaganda artwork, it was a confiscated American animated film storyboard, meticulously detailed and brought to Walter's desk by way of an alarmed film censor. The film itself had opened to massive global acclaim, lauded by critics, embraced by millions, and had recently begun its quiet infiltration into Germany via underground screenings, smuggled copies, and through neutral countries. It was, of course, Walt Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. On paper, it represented everything the German ruling party officially despised: saccharine American entertainment, steeped in superficial individualism and a sentimentalism deemed corrosive to the rugged heroic spirit of the new man. Yet, from the very top of the hierarchy, a strange, undeniable fascination, bordering on obsession, had taken root, sparking an almost absurd cultural dichotomy within the brutal efficiency of the German war machine. This fixation began not in the smoky backrooms of party ideologues, but with the man whose word was absolute, the leader himself, the head of the ruling party. As early as 1923, years before his rise to ultimate power, this man had articulated his profound belief in the power of visual media, writing that all effective propaganda must be confined to a few bare necessities and then expressed in a few stock formulas. What Disney had achieved, he observed, was precisely that: simple, resonant narratives that appealed universally, regardless of language or culture. This admiration for the craft, however, quickly became entangled with a peculiar personal obsession. Multiple private accounts, shared confidentially after the war by former personal assistants and secretaries, recalled the leader's private screenings. He supposedly had access to a 16mm copy of Snow White even before its widespread release in Germany. His inner circle recalled him speaking, almost wistfully, of the film's artistic brilliance, particularly admiring the intricate technical skill of the animation and the narrative clarity. He apparently saw himself, not unlike a tormented artist, in its struggle for aesthetic perfection, projecting his own twisted artistic ambitions onto the seemingly innocuous children's story. His private library, despite its more overtly ideological texts, held rare Disney artwork and sketches. Ernst Hans Stangl, a former close associate and propagandist who later defected, recounted how the leader was particularly struck by the evil queen. Her transformation into a withered, terrifying old hag, seeking magical answers in mirrors and potions, held a grim resonance. It represented a raw, visceral fear of lost power and external forces manipulating destiny, themes deeply woven into his own paranoid worldview. Moreover, he saw in the queen's singular focus a dark echo of his own absolutist ambition, however distorted and malevolent it might have been. The meticulous planning of the queen's wickedness, her obsessive pursuit of unchallenged supremacy, might have, perversely, appealed to his own strategic inclinations, albeit channeled through the macabre lens of a fairy tale. Beyond the personal obsession, there was a calculated, insidious propaganda utility that German officials sought to extract from the most unexpected of sources: the universal appeal of fairy tales themselves. The regime's narrative control was total. Every folk story, every legend, every children's song was to be reinterpreted, reshaped, or sometimes even banned to fit the rigid ideological mold of the ruling party. Children were inundated with stories of Aryan heroes, glorious sacrifices, and the moral imperative of purity. Snow White, despite its American origin, inadvertently provided fertile ground for appropriation, precisely because it tapped into deeply ingrained European cultural archetypes: the innocent maiden, the jealous elder, the forces of evil and good, the idyllic forest, and the enduring quest for love and beauty. These themes, detached from their specific plot points, could be twisted to subtly reinforce national narratives, the pristine innocence of a racially pure heroine, persecuted by jealous, envious forces, eventually rescued by heroic purity. This manipulation was not an abstract academic exercise. Joseph Goebbels, the architect of the public imagination, was well aware of Disney's appeal. He famously kept his children inoculated from degenerate art and films, yet records suggest he possessed a remarkable appreciation for cinematic quality, irrespective of its source. While publicly denouncing American cultural imports, he secretly acknowledged their effectiveness. He commissioned German animators and filmmakers, particularly at companies like Bavaria Film, to study Disney's techniques, though this was never to copy the subject matter, but to understand the technical prowess needed to capture and enthrall audiences. The German animated shorts and feature films of the era, though technically crude by Disney standards, show a discernible and failed effort to achieve the same smooth motion, vivid colors, and sympathetic character designs, betraying their unacknowledged source of inspiration. Goebbels, always pragmatic in his public control, recognized that an outright ban of a popular, seemingly harmless film like Snow White could unintentionally grant it forbidden fruit allure, breeding dissent and resentment among a public desperate for escapist entertainment. Better, he reasoned, to appropriate or sublimate its power than to confront it directly. Walter Brandt's initial task, upon the film's arrival at the Propaganda Ministry's film review section, was therefore multifaceted: analyze the technical proficiency, identify potential propaganda subtexts, and crucially, understand its deep emotional resonance. He convened a small, carefully vetted committee, comprised not of hardline party ideologues, but of experienced media technicians, psychologists, and cultural anthropologists, individuals whose insight was valued over their adherence to strict party dogma in matters of effective manipulation. They held secret screenings in a dimly lit projection room within the ministry, usually late at night, under strict security protocols. Dr. Helga Ritter, a child psychologist recruited from the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Society, now repurposed for applying social science to public control, was initially deeply skeptical. "This American escapism," she initially remarked to Walter Brandt, "it is soft. It fosters unrealistic dreams, not disciplined strength. Its core themes are not the virtues we teach our youth." But as the reels unspooled, she too felt a pull. The raw emotional impact of the Wicked Queen's fury, the gentle innocence of Snow White, the slapstick humor of the dwarfs, it was undeniable. "It speaks directly to the subconscious, to the primitive mind," she later reported. "It simplifies universal fears and hopes. That is its power. To disregard it would be foolish." Her analytical approach shifted from dismissal to dissection, recognizing in Snow White a potent formula for influencing nascent minds, albeit with ideological reframing. Central to this committee's deliberations was the potential reinterpretation of the film's core characters and narrative arcs to subtly reinforce elements of the German ruling party's ideology without explicit censorship or overt rewriting. The pristine, almost ethereal innocence of Snow White herself, her vulnerability in a hostile world, and her inherent connection to the natural order, animals flocked to her, reflecting a harmonious, uncorrupted essence, could be easily reframed. She could be cast as a symbol of racial purity and unspoiled national character, threatened by external, malevolent forces, embodied by the vain foreign. The queen was sometimes portrayed subtly as other through costuming or accents in translated interpretations, and corrupt evil queen. The queen, obsessed with a superficial beauty and jealous of natural purity, became an inadvertent caricature of everything the regime claimed to despise about decadence and external threats. Even the dwarves, seemingly the epitome of cheerful, hard-working, simple folk, found their unexpected place. Their industriousness in the mine, their communal living, their devotion to Snow White, their protector from perceived threats, and their simple joys could be framed as embodying a rustic, uncorrupted sense of shared community. The committee considered subtle translations and narrative pointers to reinforce the idea that their work, their unity, their discipline, and their deep-rooted connection to the earth, represented by mining for jewels, a symbolic harvesting of natural resources, were all inherent German virtues. They represented a simple, wholesome counterpoint to the Queen's dark, magic-infused wickedness, a moral order reflecting German ideals. The prince, of course, a heroic figure appearing at the story's climax, would then become the archetype of the strong, principled leader, saving the pure heroine from external evils through decisive action. This complex strategy, born of the highest echelons of power and filtered down through committees like Walter Brandt's, represented a significant cultural challenge. On the one hand, official policy relentlessly demonized all American cultural imports as degenerate and un-German. On the other, The leader himself admired its artistic merit and its capacity to engage mass audiences, leading to a silent paradox within the system. The question for Walter and his colleagues was not whether Snow White was worthy of German appreciation, but how it could be reframed, absorbed, and then weaponized. Beyond mere plot, the German High Command sought to decipher the very technical essence of Disney's animation. He was captivated by the fluidity of motion, the convincing illusion of life from still drawings. This translated into concrete directives to German animation studios to analyze every frame. While these studios, primarily at Bavaria Film and Terrafilm, lacked the enormous financial resources, skilled artists, and technological infrastructure of the American Disney Corporation, they were under immense pressure to adapt. Committees of German animators were mandated to dissect Disney's techniques for capturing expression, movement, and particularly character empathy. Walter Brandt often received detailed reports highlighting technical breakthroughs, such as multiplane camera effects, which created the illusion of depth by animating cells on different layers, an innovation far beyond what German animators could realistically achieve with their limited budgets and manpower, continually redirected to more pressing war industries. However, a key point of contention and secret debate was the figure of the Wicked Queen. While the leader had admired her focus and her transformation, other ideologues found her problematic. Her reliance on dark magic, her vanity, and her ultimate grotesque failure, while superficially serving the narrative of good triumphing over evil, could also be seen as weakness, as un-Aryan qualities. German narratives always preferred heroism born of pure strength and righteous conviction, not magical subterfuge or emotional fragility disguised as malevolence. Walter Brandt's reports, therefore, often contained nuances, how the Queen could represent not just evil, but foreign influence or the seductive lure of vanity, traits subtly contrasted with the grounded, wholesome character of Snow White. This was an ideological tightrope walk, dissecting the narrative for acceptable parts, while carefully isolating and dismissing problematic elements. The propaganda possibilities extended to visual aesthetics. The leader's aesthetic tastes, well documented in his own artwork and architectural preferences, leaned towards monumental realism, dramatic landscapes, and idealized classical forms. Yet his admiration for Snow White revealed a surprising flexibility. He admired the clean lines, the clarity of expression, and the harmonious color palettes. German artists and filmmakers, typically tasked with producing grand, Wagnerian operatic propaganda or gritty social realism, were suddenly grappling with the unexpected directives for animation that drew, albeit secretly, from an American source. This often created subtle stylistic conflicts in state-sponsored film, with a jarring blend of grandiosity and the subtle yearning for a more appealing, popular touch inspired by Disney. The film's inherent musicality was also considered. Disney's scores were celebrated for their innovation, becoming almost characters in themselves. German musical aesthetics were heavily rooted in classical Germanic tradition, with a focus on dramatic orchestration and stirring martial hymns for propaganda. Yet the committee recognized the universal appeal of Snow White's simple, catchy melodies and expressive songs. While there was no move to directly emulate such musicality, which would have been politically untenable, German propaganda musical compositions did, in subtle ways, occasionally adopt a simpler, more approachable, and lyrically repetitive structure, perhaps unintentionally reflecting an absorbed understanding of Disney's melodic accessibility. They sought to evoke a similar emotional response without the overtly sentimental nature. The broader historical context of this fascination cannot be overstated. As the clouds of war gathered over Europe, the German regime had successfully forged an ironclad image of national strength, military prowess, and unwavering discipline. This external projection, however, often masked internal anxieties, particularly an insecurity regarding its cultural soft power relative to nations like the United States, which had emerged as a global leader in entertainment. For a regime obsessed with racial superiority and cultural purity, the involuntary admiration for American popular culture, particularly Snow White, presented a deep-seated contradiction. It tacitly admitted that American cultural products, despite all denunciations, possessed a universal charm and technical excellence that Germany could not replicate on demand. It implied that culturally, the Third Reich was playing catch-up, mimicking aspects of a culture it ideologically demonized. This cognitive dissonance played out in Walter Brandt's daily operations, publicly condemning, privately studying, secretly admiring, and desperately attempting to reverse engineer or appropriate what was, fundamentally, inimical to their stated values. The role of ordinary German citizens in this equation was complex. For millions, enduring austerity and the relentless psychological pressure of total war, escapism was a precious commodity. While official channels churned out martial films and ideologically aligned entertainment, there was a quiet, desperate craving for anything that offered respite from the grim reality. News of Snow White's existence, its charm, its enchanting music, inevitably filtered through whispers, foreign radio broadcasts, despite harsh penalties, and personal anecdotes. This underground appeal often made Goebbels' censors particularly cautious. Banning it might generate more resistance than subtle permission or controlled distribution. Thus, the few cinemas that showed Snow White, often due to foreign distributor contracts or a savvy exploitation of loopholes, were always full, often with ordinary families simply seeking a moment of respite and joy, unknowingly consuming a product caught in a deeply hypocritical cultural war. Walter Brandt's personal perspective on this anomaly also evolved. Initially, he saw it purely as an analytical problem, a cultural object to be dissected for state utility. He himself came from a generation steeped in classical German arts and folk traditions. Yet, in the quiet, clandestine screenings, observing the nuanced character animations and the intricate story beats, he could not deny its brilliance. He kept a personal journal, a discreet notebook tucked away in his locked desk, where he jotted down observations beyond his official reports. He noted the purity of Snow White's animation, the terrifying, almost sympathetic malice of the Queen, the clever slapstick of the dwarves. He recorded the undeniable, almost universal appeal that defied political categorization. It was a secret, dangerous fascination, a quiet acknowledgement that beauty, artistry, and emotional resonance could originate even from the enemy, potentially undermining the very ideological foundations he was tasked with upholding. His journal became a silent testament to the inner contradictions festering within the system, where official condemnation wrestled with personal, sometimes profound aesthetic admiration. This struggle, replicated countless times in various forms within the German command, became one of the subtle, unforeseen battlegrounds of a total war, where even children's stories became unwitting combatants. The impact of Snow White even subtly permeated beyond entertainment and into applied science, specifically within medical and child psychology circles, albeit recontextualized. Dr. Lenz, a leading pediatrician at the time, and an advocate for the ruling party's child welfare programs, which focused heavily on the physical development of racially pure children, ironically encountered the film through confiscated psychology reports detailing its universal effects on children's emotions. While officially dismissing foreign influences, she privately acknowledged its capacity to evoke strong responses, joy, fear, empathy. These observations, although not openly attributed to an American film, contributed to ongoing studies within German child development psychology that, for instance, examined children's responses to dramatic visual narratives or archetypal fairy tale figures. Even in fields ostensibly removed from entertainment, the insidious reach of Snow White's artistic power silently persisted, forcing pragmatic engagement despite ideological prohibition. This pervasive cultural obsession, emanating from the highest circles, meant that German animators were constantly challenged by an unspoken impossible benchmark. While their official directives always emphasized traditional Germanic themes, allegorical tales of nature, patriotism, or historical triumphs, the subtext was clear: be as engaging, as emotionally resonant, as technically polished as that. The frustration was palpable within German animation studios. Without the budget, the technological advancements, like Disney's multiplane camera, which created groundbreaking depth of field, or the sheer creative freedom, German animation remained, by comparison, stiff, didactic, and limited. They produced propaganda cartoons that were conceptually innovative in their message, but often artistically and emotionally crude. They aspired to Disney's effortless charm, but were constantly hamstrung by resource constraints and a creative philosophy antithetical to genuine artistry. In Walter Brandt's office, as new directives filtered down and old reports piled up, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs remained a haunting presence. It was the elephant in the cultural room, a cinematic ghost that demonstrated the uncomfortable truth that American mass culture, though derided, held a power over the popular imagination that the German regime, for all its brute force and ideological control, could neither genuinely reproduce nor fully suppress. It served as a persistent, unsettling reminder that while German might conquer physical territory and silence dissent, it struggled profoundly to conquer hearts and minds with the same universal appeal that an American animated princess had achieved with such effortless grace. This hidden, unacknowledged obsession would subtly persist throughout the war, a silent counter-narrative running parallel to the official pronouncements, a tiny, colorful crack in the monolithic facade of German cultural control. It represented the peculiar and profound vulnerability of even the most brutal regimes to the irresistible power of art, imagination, and a compelling universal story, no matter its origin. And for some, like Walter Brandt, it instilled a quiet, unsettling doubt. If they couldn't defeat a simple cartoon on the battlefield of cultural appeal, what truly could they defeat? The struggle for absolute control extended to the soul itself, and a certain princess from an American film had found an unexpected foothold in its most carefully guarded corners. This silent battle, far from the roar of cannons and the thunder of bombers, revealed a deeper truth about the totalitarian regime's inherent weakness, its profound inability to wholly own the human heart, and its secret, desperate admiration for the enemy's unconstrained creative spirit. Winter 1938. The quiet, unsettling admiration for Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs festered in the upper echelons of the German ruling party, growing from private curiosity to a matter of guarded strategic analysis. What began as a surprising personal predilection of the leader himself now found itself subtly integrated into the broader, insidious efforts of the Ministry of Propaganda to reshape public consciousness. Walter Brandt's Cultural Oversight Committee, originally tasked with merely dissecting the film's appeal, soon found its mandate expanding into exploring how similar aesthetic principles, stripped of their American provenance, could be harnessed for national messaging. The challenge was immense: how to acknowledge internally the film's profound popular power without ever publicly admitting that the enemy had produced something of such artistic brilliance. The Psychological Warfare Section, a department within the Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, soon began to explore the structural elements of fairy tales, irrespective of their origin. Dr. Greta Newman, a sociologist specializing in folklore and collective consciousness, joined Walter Brandt's expanded committee. Her initial focus was on ancient Germanic myths, which were being aggressively repurposed to celebrate national purity and heroic struggle. She was tasked with understanding Snow White, not as an American film, but as a modern interpretation of deeply embedded European archetypes. The themes are timeless, she asserted in a private briefing with Brandt. The evil stepmother, the innocent persecuted, the awakening through true love, these resonate with all peoples. The Americans simply perfected the packaging. This pragmatic assessment allowed the committee to continue its dissection under a veneer of academic and cultural research, avoiding the ideological purity tests that would normally accompany any study of foreign cultural products. One significant aspect of Snow White that profoundly resonated with the regime, in a perverse way, was the narrative's rigid binary of good versus evil. German propaganda was obsessed with clearly delineated enemies and heroic figures. Snow White provided this framework in its purest form: the unequivocally good, innocent princess juxtaposed against the unequivocally evil, jealous queen. There was no moral ambiguity, no shades of grey, which perfectly mirrored the ruling party's simplified worldview. This clean moral separation could, theoretically, be translated into children's stories and other cultural products: the clear threat from outsiders, the pure victim, the nation itself, and the necessary righteous struggle for its salvation. Walter Brandt began to commission internal studies on audience response, particularly children's reactions, to such clear-cut narrative moralities. The findings consistently showed that simple narratives with absolute moral poles were profoundly effective at shaping young minds and garnering uncritical emotional support. The committee also began a deep dive into the concept of idealized natural beauty, a theme central to both Snow White and German aesthetic ideology. Snow White's intrinsic connection to nature, her effortless communication with animals, and her untainted grace perfectly mirrored the regime's fetishization of pristine, unspoiled German landscapes and the idealized Aryan physique. This wasn't merely coincidence. The ruling party regularly promoted an aesthetic that connected physical purity, connection to the land, and innate virtue. The Queen's destructive vanity and reliance on superficial artifice, therefore, served as an unintentional counterpoint, an embodiment of decadence that sought to destroy true natural beauty through superficial means. Goebbels's cinematic efforts, particularly some of the more elaborate rural propaganda films and children's short subjects, quietly reflected this learned aesthetic. Forests in these German films were often portrayed with an almost dreamlike perfection, populated by innocent animals and benevolent figures, much like Snow White's protective woodland haven. Another profound, yet unspoken element of Snow White's success, particularly analyzed by German psychological warfare experts, was its demonstration of the immense power of personification and anthropomorphism. The dwarfs, each embodying a singular personality trait, dopey, grumpy, sleepy, happy, bashful, sneezy, doc, allowed children and adults alike to connect with complex emotional states in simplified, approachable ways. This highly effective narrative technique for audience engagement was keenly noted. The German propaganda machine, already adept at using archetypal figures, the Jewish villain, the loyal farmer, saw in this a new level of refinement for character creation. Soon, in some subtle government-sponsored children's books and short animated propaganda films, figures began to emerge with similarly exaggerated, almost cartoonish, single traits: a cheerfully industrious farmer, a fiercely loyal soldier, a menacingly sly spy. These were rudimentary by Disney standards, often clumsy and overtly didactic, but the principle was undoubtedly informed by studying Snow White's effortless characterization. Dr. Newman wrote extensively in her private memos about the simple efficacy of the dwarf archetypes, observing how they provide immediate recognition and sympathetic connection, which overrides critical thought. This silent appropriation was not without its ideological struggles. Critics within the party, hardliners from organizations like the SS, Schutzstaffel, viewed any engagement with foreign culture, particularly American, as a weakening of German will. They dismissed Snow White as puerile, saccharine, and irrelevant. Yet the persistent high-level interest shielded Brandt's committee from direct interference. The implicit understanding was that this study was a tool for internal growth and refinement, a way to sharpen the edge of their own propaganda sword, not an act of homage. Publicly, American culture remained enemy propaganda, but privately, its effectiveness was undeniable. This paradox exemplified the ruthlessness and adaptability of Goebbels's machine. Ideology could be bent or subtly ignored if it promised a tactical advantage in controlling the masses. The committee extensively analyzed Disney's innovative use of color and lighting. German films of the 1930s often utilized stark contrasts, heavy shadows, and a somber realist palette, mirroring the dramatic gravitas desired by the regime. Snow White, however, employed vibrant, almost jewel-toned colors and ingenious lighting techniques to evoke mood, distinguish characters, and create breathtaking atmospheric effects. This artistic subtlety fascinated German cinematographers who, while making films for the regime, secretly yearned for more sophisticated aesthetic tools. Internal German cinematic technique discussions began to reference, without attribution, lessons learned from studying these confiscated films, the psychological impact of using cooler tones for malevolence and warmer hues for innocence, the dramatic potential of chiaroscuro lighting, even if for dark propaganda, rather than fairy tales, and the overall impact of color theory on audience emotion. A few subtle artistic elements from Snow White, stripped of its Western context, started to find their way into German propaganda posters, particularly those aimed at children. Cleaner lines, slightly more emotive figures, and brighter, almost unsettlingly cheerful palettes that masked darker messages. Consider the pervasive influence of folk music and simple, memorable melodies. Snow White was replete with catchy tunes like Hey Ho, Whistle While You Work, and Someday My Prince Will Come. These songs, with their clear narrative purpose and accessible melodies, resonated deeply. While overtly sentimental music was generally frowned upon in serious German propaganda, which preferred grand chorales and powerful marches, Goebbels recognized the need for popular, easily reproducible music for children and lighter public programming. Composers working for the state radio were encouraged to produce similar earworms, simple melodic tunes that were easily sung and remembered by large audiences. While German propaganda music never adopted the exact stylistic elements of American folk tunes, the structural simplicity and memorable catchiness were implicitly absorbed, proving a point to Dr. Neumann. Effective cultural products shared universal building blocks. These songs served to knit the narrative directly into the public consciousness, creating a seamless, memorable experience that was deeply impressive. The technical analysis that Walter Brandt supervised revealed further insights. German film labs were impressed by the sheer volume of frames, the fluid frame rates, often 24 frames per second, where German animation often struggled with lower rates for efficiency, and the pioneering work in effects animation, such as water reflections and realistic smoke. Engineers meticulously examined the cell technique, understanding how thousands of hand-painted cells were layered over static backgrounds, creating a dynamic sense of depth. While German studios were under military requisition and could not replicate the immense manpower, budget, and time required for such painstaking detail, they learned about maximizing motion efficiency, character staging, and visual economy within their own constrained parameters. Reports from studios like Bavaria Film and UFA's animation department frequently detailed lessons learned from analysis of Western animated productions, always with coded language that carefully omitted Disney's name. The internal studies went even deeper, examining Snow White's contribution to the broader phenomenon of escapism as a tool for public management. In a nation increasingly ravaged by war, Goebbels understood that relentless grim messaging could lead to public exhaustion. Periods of intense deprivation and propaganda needed to be punctuated by moments of light, of beauty, of fantasy, to prevent utter demoralization. Snow White, with its innocent charm and definitive happy ending, perfectly illustrated this principle. While state-produced escapist fare for Germans leaned heavily on melodramas, romantic comedies, and lavish historical films designed to distract from the grim realities, Snow White provided a blueprint for how a fantastical narrative, rooted in archetypal simplicity, could effectively offer solace and divert attention, without necessarily being overtly didactic. This led to subtle directives for certain German children's films to increase their reliance on pure fantasy elements, albeit Germanic folklore-derived ones, often imbued with an uncharacteristically vibrant, appealing aesthetic for their specific genres, echoing some of Snow White's charm. The impact extended to the broader realm of public health messaging. While Goebbels's propaganda often linked physical health to racial purity and martial vigor, Snow White's portrayal of the perils of poisonous apples and wicked witches, while fictional, offered lessons in caution and healthy living. Subtle messaging in German public health campaigns, especially those aimed at children, started to implicitly borrow some of Snow White's narrative power: dangers hidden in plain sight, the importance of wholesome food, even as arts food, and the need for vigilance against unseen threats. The emotional simplicity of a literal poisoned apple or tainted candy in a German propagated narrative was immensely effective at conveying risks without complex explanation. Perhaps one of the most unexpected, yet profound lessons drawn from the forbidden fruit of Snow White was about brand recognition and character longevity. Disney, even then, was establishing itself as a master of creating universally recognized characters who transcended the specific films they originated in. German officials, for whom effective propaganda required constant, consistent messaging, struggled with character development in their own visual media. Their heroes often felt stiff, didactic, and interchangeable. The enduring identifiable personalities of the dwarves, the distinct elegance of Snow White, the memorable villainy of the Queen, all of these demonstrated the immense power of sustained, consistent, and empathetic character design in achieving deep, long-lasting popular recognition. Walter Brandt noted in a meeting about youth cultural engagement how crucial it was for our heroes to become as real in the minds of the children as other figures popular globally. This carefully worded phrase subtly indicated their internal struggle to emulate what Disney had perfected. The pervasive reach of the story, even through an American lens, posed a significant paradox for the architects of German national identity. Their fervent belief in Germanic cultural supremacy stood in stark contrast to their grudging acknowledgement of the popular appeal and technical brilliance of an American production. This was a private humiliation. It revealed a foundational flaw in their cultural imperialism. They could conquer physical territory, but they struggled to colonize the popular imagination with products as universally beloved or technically accomplished as Snow White. The constant internal pressure and the inherent ideological contradictions began to wear on individuals like Walter Brandt. He had to operate within a system that demanded a schizophrenic relationship with such a potent cultural artifact, outwardly condemn it, internally analyze it, extract its essence, and then pretend Germany had always possessed such mastery. His role, once seemingly about cultural maintenance, was now becoming about a kind of cultural scavenging, extracting useful parts from the enemy to bolster the national aesthetic. The beauty and ingenuity of Snow White, intended as pure entertainment, became, within the confines of the German ruling party, a prism through which to view their own creative ambitions, their fears of cultural inferiority, and their desperate longing for a narrative power that could captivate and control without resorting solely to brute force and overt ideology. This ongoing hidden internal struggle over an American fairy tale was for many quietly dissenting figures a stark reminder that even within the most rigid and violent totalitarian state, the power of art, once witnessed, could never truly be erased, only perhaps momentarily silenced. It demonstrated that in the hidden battleground of the human spirit, some artistic creations could transcend even the most heavily fortified ideological borders, leaving behind a nagging, unsettling question for those who sought absolute control: what truly constituted purity, and what could genuinely stir the hearts of ordinary people in an age where genuine, unburdened innocence seemed increasingly elusive. Late 1944. The air raid sirens wailed with terrifying frequency over Berlin, their mournful, rising keen becoming a grim, almost constant soundtrack to the dying days of the German regime. The sprawling Ministry of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, once a hive of meticulously managed cultural control, was now a fractured, bomb-scarred testament to collapse. Walter Brandt's office, once pristine, bore the marks of near misses and improvised repairs, windows shattered and taped, files coated with a fine layer of dust and plaster. The urgent focus was no longer on subtly reshaping foreign narratives, but on maintaining any semblance of civilian morale amidst overwhelming destruction. Yet even in this maelstrom of desperation, the ghost of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs continued to haunt certain corridors of power, a testament to its peculiar, tenacious grip on the German imagination. The regime's internal contradictions, so often brushed aside for tactical advantage in the earlier war years, now erupted into open ideological clashes. Hardliners within the party, increasingly vocal and paranoid, redoubled their attacks on all forms of foreign influence, equating anything un-German with the impending defeat. The hidden studies, the quiet admirations, the secret screenings of American animation were increasingly seen as weaknesses, dangerous intellectual indulgences that distracted from the brutal reality of total war. Walter Brandt found himself caught between the leader's unshakable, if private, artistic appreciation for the film and the mounting pressure from fanatical party members who saw any deviation from rigid cultural purity as treasonous. The cultural anthropologist, Dr. Greta Neumann, a once respected voice in subtle persuasion, now had her work dismissed as intellectual dilettantism. Her studies on universal archetypes were deemed irrelevant by those who clamored for straightforward, bellicose patriotism. Despite the heightened rhetoric, subtle aesthetic elements, born from the secret study of Snow White, persisted in official, late-war German visual media. In an ironic twist, as resources for grand, live-action propaganda epics dwindled, smaller-scale, animated shorts saw a resurgence, aimed particularly at maintaining the morale of children in bomb shelters and those being evacuated to safer areas. While these films never directly copied Snow White's style or narrative, a faint, almost subconscious echo could be perceived. Animated character designs in some of these short German pieces, produced by under-resourced studios, often staffed by older, less experienced artists, displayed a marginally softer, more rounded aesthetic compared to earlier harsher Germanic propaganda caricatures. The color palettes, though limited by wartime dye shortages, occasionally aspired to a vibrant, albeit fleeting charm, contrasting sharply with the bleakness of their surrounding reality. Backgrounds might hint at an idyllic forest, an unreachable fantasy inspired, however remotely, by Snow White's gentle woodland haven. These stylistic touches, unintended by the ruling party and unacknowledged by their creators, served as tiny, almost pitiful, nods to the enduring power of Disney's artistry. A key turning point in this ideological conflict came with the leader's direct personal involvement. While his public appearances became increasingly frantic, his private moments often reverted to familiar comforts. His continued, though increasingly furtive, fascination with Snow White remained. Hans Stengel's successor, as a close associate, recounts witnessing a distraught leader, late at night, after particularly heavy bombing raids on German cities, retreating to his private screening room. He reportedly still found solace in the simple definitive morality of Snow White. This anecdote, passed through several confidential memoirs after the war, solidified the understanding that the obsession transcended mere intellectual curiosity. It spoke to a deeper psychological need, a desperate search for order and unambiguous good in a world he himself had plunged into chaos and moral grey. It reinforced his personal conviction that simplicity and clear-cut hero-villain dynamics were the most effective ways to sway minds, a conviction that his own propaganda apparatus was failing to live up to in these desperate times. The regime's internal animation studies continued, though their goals became increasingly desperate. One notorious, if rarely spoken about, development was the experimental animation unit's deep analysis of Snow White's villain, the Wicked Queen's transformation into the Old Hag. German animators meticulously deconstructed her visual progression, from vain monarch to monstrous crone. This technical study, far from being about pure artistic emulation, found an unexpected application: the portrayal of Allied leaders in satirical propaganda cartoons. While cruder and far more hateful than the original source material, some later German animated caricatures of Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt subtly drew on lessons of grotesque physical distortion and menacing visual archetypes exemplified by the Old Hag. The chilling, almost visceral revulsion the Queen evoked was appropriated and re-weaponized against enemy figures, seeking to tap into the same subconscious fears and disgust Snow White had so effortlessly harnessed. It was a dark, perverse complement to Disney's command of visual villainy, twisting innocent storytelling into virulent hatred. This forced evolution highlighted a critical paradox: the inherent weakness of a system that stifled original creativity. While German officials could dissect and appropriate elements from Snow White, they could never create something with its soul. The constant pressure to adhere to ideological purity, the lack of creative freedom, and the siphoning of artistic talent and material resources into more essential war efforts meant that German animation, despite its sporadic technical competence, always felt didactic, heavy-handed, and ultimately uninspired compared to the vibrant, spontaneous artistry it so grudgingly admired. The very conditions that gave rise to Snow White, a society allowing boundless imagination, technological innovation unhindered by rigid dogma, and a willingness to invest massively in non-military cultural production, were precisely what the German regime actively destroyed within its own borders. The Snow White effect, therefore, manifested not in a successful German rival, but in a profound cultural void. The populace, exposed to snippets of forbidden American charm, understood the difference. Their children, promised fantastical tales of brave Aryan heroes, secretly longed for the magic of an American princess and her 7 whimsical companions. This clandestine cultural longing was a subtle but potent form of quiet resistance. It meant that official propaganda, however skillfully engineered, faced an unseen, emotionally powerful competitor in the hearts and minds of its citizens, an insidious artistic rival that could not be bombed into submission or suppressed by secret police. The beauty of the American animated film became a benchmark against which the sterile, ideological art of the German state, implicitly and tragically, failed. By the spring of 1945, with Berlin a ruined inferno and the regime in its death throes, the last remnants of this curious obsession faded into the greater maelstrom of destruction. There were no more film committees, no more secret screenings. Food itself became the primary obsession, the brutal search for actual sustenance amidst the ruins, overshadowing any philosophical debates about animation. Yet, after the final surrender and the chilling revelations of the camps, the unique story of this admiration slowly came to light, piece by agonizing piece, through interrogations, seized documents, and personal memoirs. Walter Brandt, surviving the war but utterly disillusioned, spoke of his time on the Cultural Oversight Committee during his post-war denazification hearings. He described the leader's quiet obsession with the film as an anchor for his mind, perhaps. A symbol of order, of a perfect evil he understood, contrasted with a pure good he perhaps subconsciously yearned for or thought he possessed. Dr. Helga Ritter, whose family survived by escaping Germany just before the war, later reflected on the regime's failed attempts to appropriate Snow White. In her 1960 psychological journal, she wrote, "They understood its form, its archetypes, its power, but they could not replicate its spirit. True artistic magic requires freedom, compassion, and a belief in universal values. These are the very elements our society destroyed. They sought to bottle joy and wield it as a weapon, but only art born of genuine human emotion can truly conquer the heart." The revelation of the leader's secret, sustained fascination with Snow White, deeply shocked Allied interrogators. For them, it exposed an unsettling aspect of totalitarian personality, a bizarre blend of monstrous brutality and a profound, almost childlike, attraction to simplistic beauty and unambiguous morality, however perverted in application. It served as a stark example of cognitive dissonance, where a man responsible for unspeakable atrocities could, in his private hours, find solace in an innocent fairy tale film created by the very culture he sought to destroy. This bizarre dichotomy underscored the profound hypocrisy at the heart of the regime, a cultural theft masked by furious ideological denunciation. The historical anomaly of this German fascination with Snow White ultimately served as a chilling, yet powerful coda to the story of total control and its inherent vulnerabilities. Despite immense resources and brutal efficiency, the German ruling party, for all its grand ambitions and draconian laws, could never truly dictate taste, entirely extinguish imagination, or fully conquer the emotional landscape of its own people. A whimsical American princess, crafted in vibrant colors, with simple songs and universally understood fears and triumphs, inadvertently outmaneuvered the most powerful propaganda machine in history, achieving an unspoken, indelible victory on the battleground of the human spirit. The officials of the regime could not resist their obsession with Snow White, not because it aligned with their ideology, but because, on a primal level, it spoke to universal truths and artistic brilliance that their own morally bankrupt system could not authentically produce. And in that simple, beautiful truth lay a profound, unacknowledged, and ultimately enduring testament to their spectacular, tragic failure. This artistic shadow, born of admiration and twisted into attempted appropriation, would remain a bizarre footnote, forever staining the records of an empire that aspired to aesthetic supremacy but secretly found its ideal in the creative genius of its most despised enemy. The world saw propaganda, the ruling elite secretly saw a model for conquest, revealed ironically through the tale of a girl and her 7 loyal friends. Early 1945. The end was not merely nigh, it was an undeniable thunderous crescendo of Allied firepower and ground advances. Berlin was a collapsing monument to a failed dream, its once proud avenues reduced to rubble-strewn death traps. Yet, even as the walls of the bunker literally shuddered from Soviet artillery, the legacy of a small American animated film, oddly enough, continued its peculiar existence, weaving its final ironic threads into the tattered tapestry of German culture. The official Ministry of Propaganda had ceased to function as a coherent entity, but the individual psychological imprints left by Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs remained, influencing choices, shaping artistic output, and defining a strange, unacknowledged dimension of the cultural war. The profound disconnect between overt ideology and covert fascination intensified to absurd degrees in the regime's final months. Propaganda directives, still clinging to a fantasy of imminent victory, exhorted German children to embody virtues of resilience, self-sacrifice, and heroic defiance. Concurrently, desperate animators, working in makeshift studios hidden in bomb shelters, tasked with producing children's cartoons for limited distribution, often defaulted to familiar artistic touchstones learned years ago. Without the freedom to be openly inspired by an American film, they instead turned to recreating its effects through abstract, less direct means. German animated character designers began to emphasize overly large, emotive eyes, a feature instantly recognizable in Disney creations, even in narratives that otherwise adhered to a starkly German aesthetic. Faces were often softened, made rounder, intended to evoke a simpler, more universal appeal than the harsh, angular lines often seen in overt propaganda posters. This wasn't copying, it was osmosis, a subconscious adoption of universally effective visual grammar, even from a hated source. A specific example of this subliminal influence manifested in government-produced children's illustrated books and basic readers issued during the final frantic evacuations from the crumbling cities. Aimed at traumatized young audiences, these publications needed to be calming, inspiring, yet easy to comprehend. Many contained short, didactic fables featuring benevolent forest animals and innocent children navigating dangers. The visual styles of these books, far from the dramatic realism of earlier official artwork, often borrowed Snow White's delicate linework, softer pastels, and gentle depictions of friendly fauna. Trees, once rigid and imposing in German illustrations, became more inviting, almost protective. Animals were rendered with clear, sympathetic expressions. The feel was subtly different, a more approachable visual style than typical Germanic folk art, betraying an unspoken inspiration rooted in the analysis Walter Brandt's committee had once meticulously undertaken. These aesthetic adaptations served to alleviate psychological distress, unconsciously leveraging a visual language understood to evoke comfort, a testament to the film's intrinsic popular power, even under duress. Beyond visuals, the musical scores for late-war children's radio plays and animated shorts, though bound by conventional German compositional forms, sometimes revealed a hidden striving for accessibility. German composers were urged to create more eingängig, catchy, easily memorized melodies that could lift spirits, in contrast to the thunderous dramatic overtures common in military marches. While the melodic content was distinctively German, the purpose to instill comfort and uplift through simple, repeatable, emotionally direct tunes paralleled the powerful efficacy of Snow White's beloved songs. These efforts underscored the inherent struggle within the German creative community to find authentic emotional resonance without the artistic freedom necessary to produce true original appeal. The unspoken competition was less about content, more about popular penetration. The chilling hypocrisy of the leader's personal obsession continued until the bitter end. Allied intelligence operatives, painstakingly piecing together fragments from informants, defector accounts, and intercepted, sometimes cryptic, communications, eventually uncovered the extraordinary detail of his private cinematic viewing habits. While public pronouncements thundered against the depravity of American culture, the most powerful man in Germany retreated to his darkened rooms, watching the cartoon his regime decried, apparently drawing strength or simply psychological respite from its simple, stark moral landscape. This contradiction proved to be a profound point of interest for post-war Allied psychologists and interrogators, forming a key part of the behavioral profile of totalitarian leadership. It underscored how such leaders, despite their grand, inhuman ideologies, often harbored deep, seemingly innocuous human desires for simple, pure narratives, particularly when their own monstrous creations crumbled around them. The immediate post-war period brought fascinating revelations as documents were seized, diaries discovered, and interrogations conducted. Former members of Goebbels's propaganda machine, initially trying to defend their work as patriotic duty, found themselves explaining the intricate, clandestine analyses of Snow White. Walter Brandt, after being cleared of active ideological fanaticism due to his academic, analytical bent, candidly recounted the intense pressures and paradoxical directives his committee faced. He revealed details of the leader's unique artistic preferences, including the persistent admiration for Disney, which filtered down as implicit expectations to film producers and artists. His testimony contributed significantly to Allied understanding of the nuanced, often convoluted mechanisms of German cultural control. It became clear that the German regime hadn't just banned art, it had covertly scavenged from its enemies. The official public reintroduction of Snow White to West German audiences in the immediate post-war years was a powerful symbolic moment, a potent contrast to the suppressed, secretly admired artifact it had been under the former regime. The film played to packed cinemas in devastated cities like Hamburg and Munich, a poignant escape for a population yearning for normalcy and innocence. For many German children, their first real cinema experience, often a welcome dose of color and joy amidst rubble, was watching this very film. This widespread embrace subtly cleansed Snow White of its unspoken, wartime association with political intrigue, allowing it to reclaim its place as a pure, universally beloved fairy tale. Its popularity also signaled a re-engagement with international culture, marking a conscious break from the isolationist and ideologically stifling cultural policies of the former regime. In an ironic twist, many of the very German children who had been subjected to the propagandistic ersatz cartoons of the late war years, vaguely and subconsciously informed by Disney aesthetics, were among the most enthusiastic audience members for the real thing. Their implicit artistic education under duress prepared them, in a way, to appreciate the quality of the film, making the eventual experience even more potent. It allowed an entire generation to finally see the uncorrupted source of certain visual cues they had unknowingly encountered, subtly solidifying Snow White's role as a foundational piece of their post-war cultural reintegration. The lasting impact of this obsession extends to broader philosophical reflections on totalitarian cultural control versus universal artistic appeal. The German regime, for all its power to ban, burn and suppress, ultimately failed to crush the innate human yearning for stories, characters and aesthetics that transcended nationalistic and ideological boundaries. Snow White served as a poignant testament to art's ability to defy coercion. Its intrinsic beauty, its clear morality, however subjectively interpreted, and its technical mastery proved irresistible even to the most powerful and ruthless figures of its time. It was an aesthetic Trojan horse, slipping past ideological defenses, not with overtly subversive messages, but with the sheer force of its narrative and visual charm. Historians and cultural analysts now often point to this peculiar historical detail as a critical insight into the inherent vulnerability of regimes that seek absolute control over thought and imagination. While political figures can wield immense power over tangible things, armies, borders, economies, they ultimately cannot fully dictate the subconscious admirations, the unbidden artistic appreciation, or the simple human craving for enchantment, regardless of its origin. The German ruling party's clandestine admiration for Snow White became a profound unspoken acknowledgement of its own cultural limitations, a dark confession that even in its most fanatical pursuit of racial and aesthetic purity, it secretly revered a vision of beauty created by its ultimate enemy. The story of the German High Command's obsession with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is a strange, complex, and ultimately tragic footnote in the annals of totalitarian history. It speaks not only to the peculiar personality of the leader and the adaptability of his propaganda minister, but to a more fundamental truth that art, in its purest form, often transcends politics. An innocent animated princess, envisioned in California, inadvertently became a subtle, yet enduring challenge to a brutal ideology, demonstrating that true creative brilliance and its capacity to stir the human spirit can bloom in unexpected places and penetrate even the most carefully guarded psychological fortresses. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the grand theater of human experience, beauty and storytelling hold an enduring, sometimes subversive, power that even the architects of the most monstrous regimes could not resist. This particular paradox of their war, buried deep beneath layers of destruction and secrecy, provides a final shocking insight into the peculiar vulnerability of ultimate power to the simplest, most potent forms of enchantment, making Snow White an unlikely, silent witness to the psychological undercurrents of an epoch-defining conflict.